All right, thank you for everyone who's logged in already. We're going to wait just a minute here to get started. All right, thank you everyone for dialing in. This is Arizona College's annual Title IX and Clery training. Title IX and Clery are important regulations federally, but also to Arizona College for creating a safe environment for employees and for our students. A couple of house cleaning issues. All of your lines are muted, and so which will make for a good, clear sound, and we should be able to hear well. If there are questions during the webinar today, there is in your toolbar a question module. We'll be monitoring the questions and be pausing periodically to address any questions that you might have. Now I'd like to introduce Linda Rawls, who has been working with Arizona College for several years and helping us develop and refine our Title IX and Clery policies.
Thank you, Matt. Hello, everyone. This is Linda, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate you giving up part of your lunch hour. I'm sure many of you are munching yummy things at your desk while you're listening to me, and I will imagine that. But I do appreciate you taking the time to participate in our training, which is not only legally required, but as Matt said, very important to the culture of Arizona College. Excuse me. So I will watch, as Matt said, for questions. I very much welcome questions, and we have time for questions. I don't think this will take the full hour. I won't promise too much because I want to be able to deliver that. But we'll go through this. I'll make it as informative and painless as possible and try to answer anyone's questions. And we'll go from there. So we'll get started right away. So Matt and I have alluded a little bit to why we do this, but let me talk about it just for a few more seconds here. Title IX has been around since, I think, 1972, which many of you probably weren't born in 1972, but it's been around for quite a while. Clery less long, but both of them have been around. However, as you probably noticed, many things have been changing politically, culturally. There are new emphases on Title IX all the time. Some of them change depending on what's happening in the news, even made for TV movies now. And I'm sure that even if you don't follow this very closely, you've watched the scandals, the sexual abuse scandals that have happened at some big public universities and so on. We, of course, have the Me Too movement and a different administration from when some of this was trained to and discussed. So things change, and there are new emphases, and rules change. So we try to keep up, but as we'll say a couple times during this presentation, When you get confused with all the politics and movies and different opinions about Title IX, we just try to do the right things by our students and by the community, and that usually works out very well. Now, specifically on politics, and I won't get into politics per se, as much as I like to talk about them, but with the Trump administration, there was a rescission of the Obama administration Title IX guidance, which many people applauded and many people decried. That was rescinded, and this administration said they didn't believe in issuing guidance. They wanted to issue new regulations. They thought that was more proper. Then they did turn around and issue new guidance, but also new regulations. So we're in a very unique situation as we sit here today. There's a new regulation that is supposed to come out by July, beginning of July. We're not sure if it will look like the draft. We think it will look mostly like the draft that we have seen and studied thoroughly. But no one's really sure in this rather uncertain time what will come out and when it will come out. So we're under the laws and regulations that exist now until July. But once in a while, I will mention that might change in July. So you'll know what I mean, right? You'll know that means we're going to have a new regulation, and it will significantly change some parts of Title IX in ways that we will talk about. One thing we also have in this, under this administration, is a bit less, and I put it in question marks because people debate how much less, but the Office of Civil Rights, which enforces Title IX for the Department of Education, they are enforcing things, it seems, a bit less. However, to balance that out, lest we think we're, not as regulated as we used to be, we are getting more lawsuits in this area, a lot more lawsuits in Title IX. So we're always trying to do the right thing and hopefully stay out of trouble with the regulators and the courts. And again, you cannot overstate that we really just want to do right by the students. So, all right, we'll move on then. Uh-oh, technical difficulty. Oh, would you just click on the right or the left? Left, okay. All right, sorry, my little arrows aren't working, so I had to get IT help. So let's understand the structure of Title IX. A lot of people forget that it is truly a discrimination, an anti-discrimination law. As I said, it came out in 1972, and it basically said that schools who take, who take federal money cannot discriminate on the basis of essentially sex or gender, and other things were added to that later. And part of discrimination is when you have harassment or sexual misconduct, because harassment and sexual misconduct are forms of discrimination. That's a little bit counterintuitive to people. People think of discrimination in a different way, which is also illegal. For instance, I don't like men, so I'm a female professor and I grade the men more harshly than women. That would be discrimination and illegal, but it wouldn't be a Title IX situation necessarily. Well, it could be, but in many cases, discrimination is not harassment or sexual misconduct, correct? So beyond that, there are types of harassment and sexual misconduct. Quid pro quo, many of you have probably heard of that. Quid pro quo is the classic, you go out with me and I'll give you a good grade. So that is a type of harassment and sexual misconduct. Hostile environment is another type of harassment and sexual misconduct. And I want to pause and ask yourself while you're sitting at your desk, do you know where to find these definitions? If somebody puts it in the question box and gets it right, they can come by Matt's office sometime and get a Coke or a piece of candy as a prize. But it's important to know these definitions, but I don't like to just put them on a slide and read them to you. They are found in your Title IX policies and procedures and are important for everyone who is part of the Arizona college community to just at least skim that and get an idea of what these things are. So I don't see an answer yet where you can find the Title IX policies and procedures, but I'll come back to that if we don't get an answer, and I'll tell you a couple slides from now. That reminds me. So assault and stalking and other specific offenses are forms of hostile environment, and many of those were added by the Clery Act, such as dating violence, domestic violence, stalking. So we're always concerned with those. And something that wraps it all up is retaliation. Retaliation is when someone complains about any of these things, and then they get a bad consequence for that. You know, I complain about my professor being inappropriate, then I get a bad grade. Or, you know, I come to the Title IX coordinator and complain, and, you know, the school mistreats me in some manner. I don't get my clinical at the time I need it, and I think there's a connection. So retaliation is a whole separate Title IX offense. And I have found over my decades of doing this kind of law that I think schools get in trouble more for retaliation. It's at least as common as the offenses themselves, or you know, it's right up there. So we have to be very careful when we're handling a Title IX case that we don't appear to retaliate or to retaliate. So do you need to know all this that's on this slide? No, of course not. You don't need to know the structure and what is a part of what. I just give that to folks because it is confusing, but you have to see that from retaliation to discrimination, all these types of sexual misconduct are covered by Title IX. So it's a broad-based law. Okay. So let's understand the scope a little bit more. We were showing it in one way on the last slide, but just to show you how broad this is, we talked about discrimination and what all forms of discrimination are, but it can be discrimination or any of that sexual misconduct that's based on sex, gender, all these things that are listed here. These are some of the areas that may at some point change, because some of the ones that are not strictly sex and gender are a little bit controversial as to whether they should be covered, but you don't have to be a lawyer and know that. We'll talk about when you should let the Title IX coordinator know when you know of a situation, but you don't have to sit there and say, now is this in gender or pregnancy or parenting? If you think it's in Title IX and you report it, other folks will figure that out and sort it all out, and may have to address it even if it's not a Title IX issue, right? Because we don't want certain things to happen even if they're not under Title IX. Many people don't realize, and so we remind ourselves, that Title IX applies to employees as well as students. We have Title VII for employees as well, but Title IX applies even if it's employee-on-employee sexual misconduct. So if there's an employee-employee situation, we have to look at 9 and 7. If it's a student and an employee, we have to sort that out. And it can be third parties or anyone in the Arizona community. I am visiting Matt's corporate office today to do this webinar, and if I misbehaved on the way out, that would be a Title IX situation, because I am a vendor, a third party, who's now part of the Arizona community. So it's anyone who touches the educational purpose in any way of Arizona College. And it is tied to education programs and activities, but when you think about the fact that any of that could affect education, it's really anything within the community. You know, everything from I can't go to class because my girlfriend has threatened to shoot me if I show up at school, and that's a Title IX. It's also probably a crime, but it's a Title IX situation. I just don't feel comfortable coming to class because of the way my professor speaks to me or the person next to me in clinical. So, and that it also covers any kind of educational activities outside of the classroom. So it's pretty broad. And again, you don't have to figure that out. You just have to let someone else know, and they will figure out those nuances. The next bullet says, no matter where it occurs, there's a question for a reason. And that is because the current regulation and law say that it can occur anywhere as long as it affects the educational experience. It's a Title IX issue. This happens a lot with domestic violence, My husband doesn't want me to get an education. When I go to class, he beats me up. He does it at our apartment. Currently, that could very well be a Title IX issue because it's affecting her ability or my ability to come to school. The Obama regulation is controversial for many reasons, but for one reason, because it would, if it comes out in the same form that the draft regulation was written in, it will rather drastically pull this back, and schools will not be involved in cases that are that far flung. Again, whether you think that's a good thing or not depends on your perspective. So, what are your responsibilities? As you sit there and you think, well, what does all this have to do with me? I don't know of any. I haven't done anything. No one's done anything to me. You're not an investigator, most of you on the call, although I see a few names here I recognize who might end up being an investigator in some situations. But unless you know you're an investigator, you're not an investigator, which is a whole other training and endeavor for people. Most of you are responsible employees, and if you know something, you need to let the Title IX coordinator know. And the head honcho Title IX coordinator is Matt Calhoun, and I hope you know how to get a hold of Matt. And if not, it's in that same document that no one's told me where to find yet, but it's with your Title IX policies and procedures, which you can find on the web under the annual security report, correct?
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a really important topic because I think some people think, oh, well, if I'm not in official capacity, a Title IX investigator, then maybe I don't need to report this. And if you work at Arizona College and someone reports to you a Title IX violation or any sort of crime, you have a responsibility.
Yeah, and thank you for who answered the question. It's in the academic catalog, but it's specifically in the annual security report, correct?
That's correct. That's correct, and it's on the same page where you find the academic catalog.
Yeah. So thank you for the person who answered that. So some of you are also campus security authorities under Clery. We're not covering that specifically today. If you're not sure if you're that, you could probably also ask Matt that question. But I don't want to get into that too much. But if you don't know what you are, you don't know if I'm a Clery Campus Security Authority, I guess I'm another responsible employee under Title IX. Again, we tell you these things, but you don't have to remember them because all you have to remember is if a student or someone else tells you something that you think might be a Title IX situation, just, send an email or give Matt a call, and he'll tell you if he's going to take it from there or not to worry about it or what you do. So you just have to be alert to that. We already have covered this, I believe, about responsible employee. You note that even though it talks about people with supervisory duties are the authority to address or remedy the situation, it's those with the responsibility to report under the current law and regulation. I always get a kick out of this because it's who is a responsible employee? Whoever has a responsibility to report. So it's so circular, but that's how it's written. Those darn lawyers, wrote it that way. So this covers just about everybody, and that's why I always say don't worry about if you do have that responsibility, just assume you do and call Matt. Now the new regulation, if it looks like it did in the draft form, might change this somewhat and narrow who has to report, but we're not going to worry about that now. For one thing, this is the law now, and we don't know what the new regulation is going to say exactly. And secondly, Arizona College does care about what's happening with the student bodies and people in tough situations. So it never hurts for Matt to know what's going on and then to decide whether it needs to be elevated to an investigation or whatever. So let's just say everyone needs to tell Matt everything, and he'll worry about what to do with it from there. I'm sorry. Oh. One more. There we go. Don't have the magic touch. So you need to know your Title IX coordinator, Matt Calhoun, and you need to be familiar with your policies and procedures and how an investigation works. Even if you're not an investigator, because a student might ask you, or you might want to know, or somebody in the break room, or might say, this happened, do you have any idea if I say anything, what's going to happen? It's just good to know these things. And again, we've told you where to find those. What's really interesting when you look at that document, you'll see all the crimes and the definitions, which are good to know anyway. You'll see what's a criminal offense in each jurisdiction, because I know some of you are calling from different places. And you'll see what the definitions are under Title IX itself. We have to decide sometimes which definition to use based on where the student is, etc. Again, that's our problem. But what you need to know is that it can be a Title IX violation, even if it's not a crime. So it's very hard to, sit there and say, well, this doesn't seem right. I'm uncomfortable in this situation, but gosh, I haven't been sexually assaulted. It doesn't, it doesn't feel like, any crime I've seen on Law and Order or anything. Well, it still might be a Title IX violation, and it still might be addressable by our system so that we can take care of that. Now it only wants one, man.
Yeah, we'll back it up.
I'm sorry, we're having so you wonder we're not just going crazy in the room here, but the clicker sometimes wants one click and sometimes wants two, so we keep jumping around. I hope we're not making you dizzy. So I'm not going to read, thank goodness, all these statistics. And, we could debate some of them. These are only some of them, and they're also debated. But the debated part is are things getting worse? Are people just reporting more? I don't really think it matters. I think it just matters that, that doesn't matter, but what matters is that we know that some people are at higher risk than others, that it is a problem in a college atmosphere, no matter what statistic you look at. It seems to be getting worse or more reported, but still bad in many cases in the college or university context. So we have to have a special sensitivity to this type of behavior because we're in a high-risk environment, not in Arizona College. Arizona College is, not a higher risk than some other ASU, but in general, colleges and universities see more of sexual misconduct and unacceptable behavior. So these are just some statistics for you to look at if you're interested. I think you already know what the problem is. We've had so many things on the news lately, from the Nassar and different people in the big universities that get a lot of press, but also throughout all of our culture. And one thing to emphasize, it's not always men on women or the stereotypical sexual misconduct that you think. It can surprise you what types of bad behavior people of all stripes can perpetuate on each other. So we don't want to think that it's always, men and women. Let's just do. There we go, a solution. So we also have to know a little bit about perpetrators. This is the kind of thing that we all have a responsibility to know in Title IX. Perpetrators, as you know, often use psychological tactics, and many times they repeat. So if we don't find bad behavior and stop it, it's likely to happen again, and it could be worse the next time. The news is full of those kinds of stories, not just on sexual misconduct, but on school shootings and other really unfortunate situations that people weren't paying attention to the who turned out to be the perpetrator, and so they did something really bad because nobody got him counseling or her counseling or did anything when it was something that could still be fixed. Usually, someone known to the victim is the perpetrator. So a few things to know about that. And also about the victims. I am always surprised at how misunderstood victims are. There are some cases of false reporting and fake victims, of course. But the statistics show that overwhelmingly people who say something are not making it up. Now, when we do an investigation, we have to be totally neutral, and we are. because it does happen sometimes. So you want to be very fair and give fundamental fairness to all people involved. But when someone says to you that they're a victim, it's best not to doubt them or argue with them, because even to speak up is very hard for many victims because they have a sense of shame. In sexual assault, oftentimes the victim didn't resist or hung out with the perpetrator afterwards, which no one ever understands. Well, if you did that, why did you hang out with him after? They might tell stories that don't quite mesh because they have a lack of memory. Their emotions might seem odd to you, but we can't judge that. Most of us aren't psychologists, and if we are, we probably know that we can't rush to judgment. People are afraid that something bad will happen to them. They'll be assaulted all over again if they turn it in. So we need to be careful if someone says something to us not to be too judgmental of the victim. I'll tell a quick little story of this makes me look bad. I was watching a really bad crime show the other day, but they were interviewing one of the jurors who had sentenced a woman to death. And she admitted in the interview that she didn't like the defendant because they had gotten fake breast implants and wore too much jewelry, and so that was suspicious. So, you know, we all have our stereotypes. I'm amazed that she admitted something like that and then sentenced this woman to death, which from the show seems perhaps she didn't do it. But we all have our little things like that that maybe we just don't tell people, and we have to catch ourselves when we're doing the judgment and make sure that we're not judging the victim. So with all that, how to talk to a possible victim, you're all faculty and staff. So if another faculty or staff or a student says something to you, you should explain to them that you have a responsibility to report, but that the Title IX coordinator is the place we want to get them to. You can be empathetic. Don't make conclusions. Don't press for information. But if you get some, that's great. You can pass it on to Matt, to the coordinator. So if they offer, here's the kind of information you would want to get that you can pass along to Matt. But again, if they don't want to give it to you, you can just then report what you do know. This is a big one. So if you've kind of drifted off, this one I just need your quick attention for, because this is where I see one of the top 4 places where by the time I get involved in the Title IX case at one of my clients, this has gone a bit awry. Someone will say, well, we will keep it confidential, because that's an intuitive thing to say, right? You say to somebody, that's okay, you can tell me, I won't tell anybody, or, you know, I'm sure the school will keep it confidential. You could never promise confidentiality. We try to give it when we can. There are a lot of legal principles around when we can and when we can't that you don't have to know. But you do have to know that in many cases we can't give confidentiality, usually because we have to work with the alleged perpetrator, and we have to protect the community at large. We always have to think of the whole community and not just this alleged perpetrator and alleged victim. So we have to make that decision about confidentiality at the level of mass level. And if someone has already promised confidentiality and we then say we can't do it, there's usually a lot of resentment on that. Well, they told me it'd be confidential. So please don't promise confidentiality to a victim.
Yeah, Linda, I think that was one of the hardest things for me to wrap my brain around, because I always wanted to try and get the person who was bringing a complaint to me to open up, tell me more about it. And so there's a tendency to want to say, well, you know, this is all in confidence. Right? And it can't be in confidence. If they're making an allegation that's going to be investigated, then there's no way to do that without making it clear to the person that's being accused of who's accusing them or during the investigation. And we have a responsibility to the rest of the student body to complete the investigation. Exactly. So once we find out about potential sexual assault, whether the victim wants us to do an investigation or not, it's really not up to them. We have a responsibility.
Right. Yeah, sometimes that they've been promised that as well. It's a great point that, you know, they'll get to decide, and often they can't. Now, it might change a little bit under the new regulation, but we're not sure, and this is the law now, and probably in many cases that will continue to be the case. So great point, Matt. I appreciate that. So you're going to report if you know something. You're not going to investigate, but it's good to know some of these things because you can help us reinforce them to the alleged victims. They can get interim measures in some circumstances. You know, we don't just assume the perpetrator is guilty, but we will do things as harmless as possible to both parties that allow both parties to continue their educational endeavors. Usually that, you know, that might be changing class schedules or some type of thing. So if someone says, I can't report it because I have to be in this class with her and all that, you can say, well, they will talk to you about interim measures. Don't promise anything, but you can tell them that that is the kind of thing that we do look into and grant when we can. And also it's important to preserve any evidence. If someone came up to you and said, you know, I was raped, but I haven't gone to the doctor, they need to go to the doctor and have a rape kit so that evidence is preserved. They also need to know that there's a difference between our response as Arizona College and the police. They're not the same thing. They operate in parallel. There's sometimes cooperation when possible, but it's not the same. So they need to know there will be two separate procedures. And that happens often when maybe someone reports something and we call the police because we think a crime was committed, and they talk to the police. They still need to know that our Title IX process goes on separately from the criminal response, and that we do everything we can to protect an alleged victim from retaliation. And I say we're going back to examples and role play, but we would do that if we were all in the same room, and I don't think we're going to have time for any of that today. So the sum of your responsibility is to listen and report, know the resources that are available. We also can give victims counseling contacts and places they can go to get help, so they need to know that. So know a little bit about what we can do for students, so when students are reluctant to come forward, you can tell them some of these things so they get, you know, more comfortable that you know about what's going to happen, and then they'll know what's going to happen, and that we can, in many cases, help them. So you listen, report, and inform the students of what you do know about the process, because you're all going to go after this and read the policies and procedures in the annual security report, I'm sure. So, and don't judge or press for details, or, you know, it's hard not to give advice sometime, but try to limit your advice because it may or may not be helpful. I know I have that problem. I always want to advise people. And then also, we're asking you all to be active bystanders. Active bystanders, it's, you know, we just used to call it doing the right thing, but now it has two words, active bystander. So you don't just see a situation, but you take steps to keep it from escalating or to stop. It is amazing for those of us who like to read about the psychology of these things, how oftentimes something can happen and no one will say anything. And there are many reasons for that. One is that if you'll recall many, many years ago, maybe you've read about it if you weren't even alive then, a woman was raped on the streets of New York and nobody helped her and nobody called the police. And that prompted quite a debate in this country, and it, you know, things like that have happened since, and we continue the debate. I'm sure it happens in other countries as well. But if I see something happening, then, well, it did happen to me. I was in New York and I saw a gang start to fight, and most people were just trying to get to safety because they think, well, that's not my moral responsibility, or someone else will do it. It's called diffusion of responsibility. So if I was the only one who saw that, and I knew if I didn't call the police wouldn't come, whether it was someone being raped or a gang fight or whatever you would see in the hall at Arizona College. If you're the only one who sees something, you're more likely to do something because you have all the moral responsibility. But if 15 people are in that hallway or 100 people are on that street in New York, we just assume someone else is going to do something, right? I mean, someone else will call the police. Someone else will stop them. And then often nobody does. When I was in New York and I called the police to come stop this fight, many people were simply taking pictures. And we have that problem as well. So we need a little more active bystander intervention. You have to do it safely. Never do anything that's going to put you in danger. Sometimes people might know someone and say, hey, Joe, is something going on here? If you know Joe, or you can distract by, or sometimes even just looking and watching, the person will stop because someone is staring and seeing what they're doing. Or you might say something like, if it were me, I might not want to have an altercation here on the campus. It could really affect you. So whatever you can do, again, there is a line there. You don't want to cross the line and put yourself in danger, but we would be better off as a college and as a community and a country if more people did be active bystanders. I'm throwing this in on disabilities because we don't get all of you together like this very often, and it's always good to remind people of this. And you might be surprised to find out how many times issues overlap. I'm not saying people with disabilities are more likely to be sexual offenders. What I'm saying is that oftentimes people who do inappropriate behavior also have some type of disability. So there are many cases when we will get a Title IX case, and it will end up being a Title IX case, a disability case, a clear case, and we have to sort it all out. And again, you don't have to do that, but it's good to know who your disability coordinator is on your campus and have some idea of the disability policies and procedures. And the main thing that you can do, and I'm sorry if I got a little reference to faculty here with a smiley face, but faculty have a lot of interaction with students, so they're trying to do the right thing, and they tend to give accommodations outside the process more than other people would because they're in, I was a faculty for 10 years, so I know you're in the classroom, you're trying to help the student, you're trying to get the student through the class, but we can't give accommodations until they've identified their disability and we've granted reasonable accommodations. So we need to keep an eye on that because we can end up in litigation over that, and no one likes to be in a deposition or in the litigation when we might have been able to avoid it if we followed the procedure. So that's my plea on there. Matt, do you need to add anything on that? Okay. So it is about the culture. It's always about the culture, no matter what laws you have, no matter what regulations you have. You can tell that by, like I said, where I started, the movies that are out on this, the books, the high-profile cases. And I'm sure that if we have, 50 people on this call, we have 50 different opinions, and they're probably linked to your political opinion. But I think we can all agree that we at Arizona College want a culture where people behave properly, no one feels uncomfortable or like they can't come to class or come to teach, and that's all we're trying to do. Put all the politics and everything aside and say we just want to make sure that people treat each other with respect and that we educate our students and that we like to come to work in the morning. And if we think that way and you learned a couple things today that help us do that, we're very appreciative. And if you want to answer any of these questions in the little thing, you can. You probably won't. But if you have questions afterwards, and we're at the end here, you can always reach out to Matt, and Matt knows how to get a hold of me, and we can answer anything that wasn't clear today or any concerns that you have. Oh, I have a question. They could certainly report anonymously.
They don't know the question.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's right. Can a student report anonymously? Rather, can they request not to be identified? Yes and no, and I know that's a horrible answer. I suppose anyone could pick up a phone and say to Matt, you need to know that this student is acting inappropriately, and I'm not going to tell you who I am. But we can't we can't really open a Title IX case without a complainant. So it's very hard, if not impossible, to do a Title IX anonymously. For one thing, and this is going to increase as a new regulation comes out, whoever is accused has a right to know who's accusing them and what they were being accused of. And in the new model that might be coming in July, that Matt and I will have to come back to you on at some point and say, hey, we have a new model, you might have to, in many cases, have an actual hearing, like it's not a full-fledged trial, but you'll have a hearing, and students have a right to call witnesses and all that kind of thing. So just like you can report a crime anonymously, it's very hard then to arrest and prosecute somebody without knowing, you know, who the accuser is. So in general, the answer would be no. Thank you very much. Excellent question.
And that was it?
Yes. And that's it. Matt, you have anything you want to say?
Well, I just want to thank everyone for participating in the training today. We did make a recording of the training, and we're going to make it available to all staff in case you missed anything. And if you have any questions in the meantime or want to ask your question outside of this session, then please reach out to me. Again, thank you everyone for participating, and thank you, Linda.
Thank you.
It was an excellent presentation today.
Thanks, everyone.